different from the one that's disseminated by popular media. In fact, portrayals of war, not only by the film industry, but the news industry and television, have very little to do with the reality of war itself. And there may be people here who come from countries where you have experienced that kind of violence. There may be veterans in the room, and I think I taught a graduate class once at NYU where most of my students had come from outside the United States, including countries like Afghanistan, and we were able very quickly to find a common vocabulary to discuss the issue of institutionalized violence. Okay, to discuss the issue of institutionalized violence that I find often within the United States for people who have not experienced the culture of war is foreign to them. So first I'll just give you a little bit about my own experience with war. It's a 20-year period. Anyone see the movie The Hurt Locker? That movie? So that actually opens with a quote from my first book, War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning, about war being a drug. And that book, which is not a chronological account of my time as a war correspondent, attempts to break down the various facets of the culture of war. And one of the things in the book that I wanted to do that was maybe counterintuitive, I read so many memoirs of, in particular, war correspondents, where the sub-theme is, I am not only incredibly courageous, but incredibly brilliant, was to never bring myself into the book unless it was to expose a moral failing. There may be moments in the book where I'm a neutral observer, but I will only bring in a personal experience to expose a moral failing. I'll give you an example of a story I tell in the book. I was in the Sudan when Sadiq Ahmadi was being overthrown in a coup, in a presidential coup, and most of the lights were out in Khartoum. There was a curfew, and I and another Wall Street Journal correspondent were attempting to get back to our hotel, and we unfortunately made a wrong turn down the presidential, the street towards the presidential palace, and of course the presidential guards were very nervous, and we could hear them all flip their safeties off their automatic weapons, and without thinking, because fear, as anyone who's been afraid like that can tell you, you begin to think with another part of your brain, I stepped behind one of my closest friends so that the bullets would go for him first. It was an instinctual reaction, one that I'm not at all proud of, but one that I think illustrates what happens when fear and terror takes over your body. I went into war as an idealist. I'm a seminary graduate. I was at Harvard Divinity School. I had wanted to be an inner city minister so that when I graduated from college, I moved across the street from a public housing project in Boston, in the section of Boston, Roxbury, which is impoverished, mostly marginal community, people of color, and I ran a church there for 2.5 years, grew increasingly disenchanted with liberal institutions, people who, like the poor, didn't like the smell of the poor. I was commuting into Harvard Divinity School, where everyone was having discussions about empowering people they never met. And I became very influenced by a journalist named Robert Cox, who had been the editor of the Buenos Aires Herald during the Dirty War. The Dirty War in Argentina was a period of time when there was an urban guerrilla movement, and the response of the militarized state was to carry out horrific forms of oppression, including disappearances, the desaparecidos, 30,000 Argentines being disappeared by their own military. And Bob had printed above the fold of the paper, and it was the only paper in Buenos Aires to do it, each day the names of the desaparecidos, people who had been taken the night before, until he was picked up and is only alive because of the British citizen, the the British government intervened to save his life and ferret him out of the country. He was fellowship that year at Harvard. And that for me was an important point where I'd always been a writer and began to understand perhaps the so-called objectivity and neutrality of American journalism in fact not only obscured the truth but stymied the capacity that we should all have towards furthering systems of justice and denouncing oppression. And so I asked Bob, I left to study Spanish and then dropped out, went to Latin America, and I asked Bob what books I should take with me. He said, you should take 4 volumes of the collected letters and essays of George Orwell, which I did, I carried with me. I lived for a year in Latin America. I studied Spanish at the Instituto de Idiomas run by the Catholic Missionary Society, the Maryknoll Fathers in Bolivia, went on and freelanced, ended up in Argentina, and then I did come back and finish my degree, but at that point decided that I was going to be a journalist in Latin America, that was as close, I thought, this was in the early 80s, that my generation was going to come to fighting fascism. Little did we know that we would have fascism on our doorstep. We have to read the tweets out of the White House to know what I'm talking about. And I went off to Latin America at a time when these kind of fascist regimes, Pinochet in Chile, the Despots in El Salvador were killing 700 to 1,000 people a month. Rios Montt was massacring literally thousands of people in the highlands of Guatemala. Of course, the Argentine regime. And I went to El Salvador and spent 5 years there as a war correspondent. I went as an idealist. I went as somebody who wanted to use the power of journalism, use my writing to give a voice to people who were being murdered, tortured, and oppressed. The Salvadoran Civil War. Anyone here from Salvador? The Salvadoran Civil War was a brutal, brutal war. Half of the country was landless. The entire economy of the country was controlled. They called them the 10 families, but a little more than 10. But these oligarchic families who owned huge coffee fincas where people would work seasonally and then be destitute. And there was a strong, peaceful movement for land reform that was met with very severe repression, including a huge march in 1979 where the state security, the police, mounted literally machine guns on the roofs of the buildings downtown and machine gun people in the streets. This precipitated quite an insurgency, which I covered. And what I found, I think it doesn't matter why you go to war. People go to war for different reasons. There's a very fine book called The War Gone By, I Miss It So, by Anthony Lloyd. He's a British correspondent about the war in Bosnia. I knew Anthony. I also covered the war in Bosnia. And his reasons for, he was an ex-military. He wanted the adrenaline rushes. He was also a heroin addict. And the war kind of filled that kind of addiction, that opioid addiction that he had as an addict. And that was a very different reason to go to war. Some people go to war as voyeurs. But in the end, it doesn't matter. Whatever your reason to go to war, and when you live in the miasma of that culture, you ultimately become contaminated by that culture. And it's one that I kind of ruthlessly attempt to expose in War as a Force that gives us meaning. And I don't use that term addiction or a drug lightly. Because when you spend, and I spent 20 years as a war correspondent, I went from Central America to the Middle East, where I spent 7 years, much of that time in Gaza, covered the civil war in Yemen, in the Sudan, after the 1991 coup, I was in Algeria, and then went on and covered the war in Yugoslavia. I was in Sarajevo, and then covered the war in Kosovo. So what happens in that environment is that the culture of war, any kind of wartime culture, it's all about the destruction of all of the systems of life, the systems that make communal life possible. Economic, political, social, cultural, religious. All of those systems are destroyed in wartime. And one of my problems in the way war is portrayed by the popular media is that it is always war porn. Even the supposedly kind of anti-war movies like Platoon or I can't think of a few others, but it's always that graphic image of violence is seductive. And one always is essentially through popular depictions of war relates to the person who is carrying the weapon and inflicting the violence. And in fact, that's a very skewed perception of war, because the percentage of people in a war zone who have that godlike power to take life is in the single digits. And the only way to understand war is to see it from the perspective of the victims, because there is a gigantic chasm between the all-powerful, those who wield the violence, and the all-powerless, those who are stripped of all power and protection and are utterly defenseless. So for me, the best kind of depictions of war are movies and books that actually don't focus on those scenes of violence. Elsa Morante wrote, the Italian novelist, wrote a very fine book called History, a Novel, and it's the story of a single mother who's raped by a German soldier and impregnated by a German soldier in a rape, and she's raising her child alone in the midst of German-occupied Italy. Or the 1950 film by René Clément, Forbidden Games, which is, it's about a column of refugees in France who are strafed by German planes. That's the only violence in the film. And the rest of the film is about a boy and a girl. They've been orphaned. The girl has been orphaned, and she's with the boy. And they spend, all they do is bury things. It gets the kind of, pathology of death that is always about war. And that's always a clash, even with veterans, at least those that are honest and conscious, when they come back into the culture, have a very hard time adjusting. So if anyone knows that history, there was a movie, Clint Eastwood made it. It was about the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, the flags of our fathers, or something it was called. There's a good book on it, actually, and all of those, it was none of those people who had come from Iwo Jima. My uncle actually fought in the South Pacific and was both physically and psychologically destroyed by it. They had to cater to the myth, and at the end, one of them drinks themselves to death, one of them commits suicide, and another one just finally won't talk about it anymore. And that is the clash that all of us who come out of war zones bring back to the wider culture. It's the clash between the reality, the sordidness of violence, industrial violence, what it actually is, and that epic myth, that celebration of violence that is perpetuated by the wider culture for obvious reasons, in that the American military is the instrument by which American imperialism is furthered throughout the globe. And one needs that kind of, to imbue those soldiers and Marines who go abroad with a kind of heroic stature, which really is at tremendous odds with their own experience. I think in some ways it's doing them a tremendous disservice, because it's not honoring the reality, I'm talking about those who've been in combat, the reality that they have had to face. So in the war in Salvador, what happens when you get into a situation of combat is, I describe it as kind of, in the span of a few hours of combat, it's possible to replicate perhaps every synthetic drug experience that you all can have in Queens. Whether that's, no sleep and that kind of zombie, hashish, doped out, disconnect, whether it's that zipped up on adrenaline or whether it's even that kind of hallucinogenic landscape where you see things. I mean, even now, I look back on some of the experiences that I had, and they're almost too fantastic in terms of what you're visually seeing the process. And it's not something that is easily translatable to a world of relative normalcy. So, I mean, I can give you an example. During, I went into Kuwait in the first Gulf War with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. And you had, because of the heavy bombing, the Iraqis didn't have any water in the front trenches. And they surrendered very quickly, and what they wanted was water. There were 4 belts of minefields that we had to navigate. And if there's any veterans here, you'll know how this is done. You set up rockets, and you fire them maybe a foot off the ground, and those rockets explode the mines. Then you put colored trash cans through those cleared minefields, and that's where your armored vehicles, that's how you'd be entered very quickly. But these Iraqis would come towards us and they would step on the mines and blow their legs off. And you couldn't go out and get them in the minefields because those areas had not been cleared. And yet, even with their legs shredded, it could take them 6 hours to die. You know, I always say that if we talk about real-time coverage, and this was something that we saw in particular with the recent invasion of Iraq, but that, of course, is a complete myth. There is no real-time coverage. It's heavily sensitive. If you want to know what war is like, then you could set up in real-time coverage a camera, and you could watch somebody with their legs blown off bleed to death for 6 hours. That's what war's like. But those kinds of images you'll never see. So, for instance, I covered the war in Yugoslavia in Sarajevo at a time when the city was being shelled, 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 2 dozen wounded a day. When I got there in the spring of 1995, 45 foreign correspondents had been killed. You know, dozens upon dozens had been wounded, including my photographer, 3 days after I arrived. And what happened in Sarajevo was, because there was no running water, there were central water taps set up throughout the city, but the Serbs who had surrounded Sarajevo, so the Serb forces had surrounded the city, which was in a bowl, and they used tanks, essentially as artillery pieces. And so we were being shelled not with mortars, but we were being shelled with 90mm tank rounds, 155 howitzers, the Soviet equivalent of 155s, these are shells like this, and Katyusha rockets, which are fired in bursts of 12 or 24. You watch them whoosh, they call them organ grinders. You'd hear them whoosh, and you could see the rockets flying in kind of pods, and they take down a 4 or 5 story apartment building and kill everyone inside in a matter of seconds. But what the Serbs did is targeted those water taps so that when, and this was a great kind of dilemma that families had, you know, so a mother, most people were living in basements, but you need water, would go to the water tap and the shells would come down. And, you know, what that did, I actually have never been able to eat meat since I left Sarajevo, because the sight of blood on a plate and meat just is too evocative of, you know, what these shells did to these bodies. None of these images were ever transmitted. It was always carried, however shocking it was very carefully packaged and very carefully censored within the media, so that the reality of war itself was hidden. The only people who actually see war are the people who've been to war. And that's by design. What war does is it inverts the moral order, turns the moral order upside down. So, for instance, when I covered the war in former Yugoslavia, they have hyperinflation. Often, when societies collapse, hyperinflation, economic distress is a byproduct of war. and you would have fleets of SUVs with tinted windows racing through the streets of Belgrade, and all of those people who lived on fixed incomes or worked hard all of their lives were in the bread lines to get food, because wars always elevates a kind of mafia economy, and it unleashes the worst kind of predators. I mean, the people in Bosnia who were the wealthiest people off of war, and there are many ways to profit off of war, were the people who handled the body trade. What that meant was that if there was a soldier from Sarajevo who had been killed and was in Serb-held territory, they would hold the body hostage until the family could raise enough money to buy it, and vice versa. And then they would transport these bodies back and forth across the Drina River. And this was a very lucrative business. Prostitution explodes in wartime. So, interestingly enough, does pornography. Tito's Yugoslavia, communist Yugoslavia, had, like many communist regimes, a kind of puritanical streak to it. But once the war started, homegrown Yugoslav porn films proliferated. Rape camps, it's women and children who always suffer the most in war, were ubiquitous in Bosnia, and people know about that conflict. The Serbs would take Muslim, often mothers and daughters, and put them in cheap hotels where they would be raped for 2 or 3 weeks, and then taken down to usually the Drina and executed, and their corpses would float down the river. And in the book, I interview women who've come out of these rape camps. This is an endemic quality of war. Those who have a penchant for violence, even a kind of lust for violence, are those who are always elevated in wartime. So that, for instance, in Sarajevo, when the Serbian forces became physically aggressive, the first people to man the defenses in the city were gangsters. I mean, literally Cello, some of the most famous gangsters in Yugoslavia, because they had access to weapons. And when they weren't manning those barricades, they were terrorizing ethnic Serbs who remained in Sarajevo, looting their apartment, often executing them. I've been with American units primarily in the Middle East, and only about maybe 2% of any armed unit is, I think, certifiably psychopathic, in the sense that they have a kind of dark need to murder. But the problem is that the rest of the unit won't stop it. So you'll be going through, mud-walled village in southern Iraq, and these people will be spraying, their belt-fed saws into the sides of the huts as they go through the village. And most of the rest of the people in the unit think they're sick, which they are. But the problem is that because of that kind of, and I want to close a little bit by talking about this, that kind of sense of comradeship, one never turns on one's own. There is a kind of code of silence, which extends to the press. I mean, I had many friends of mine who went over to cover the occupation of Iraq and would be embedded. That was something, by the way, I never did. I never embedded with any unit. I speak Arabic, so I don't need to be I don't need my handheld. But once you embed with a unit, you become a propagandist for that unit. So, and it's usually the lie of a mission. So that when they were with a unit, there were checkpoints all over the place, and if a car approached that checkpoint too quickly, in the slang of the Marines or the soldiers, you light it up, which means you just unleash on a kind of volley into the car, killing family. And every journalist I know who was embedded saw it, and none of them wrote about it. Because the moment they wrote about it, they wouldn't be embedded in it. And that was the only way to cover Iraq. And there is a kind of often surrendering of your integrity once you're with a unit, which is why I just won't, as a matter of principle, embed. I didn't embed in the first Gulf War. I went with the Marines, but I wasn't part of the pool reports. I think the press, if we look traditionally throughout our history, is always part of the problem, in the sense that it feels that it's kind of patriotic duty to support the cause, to do what it can for the cause, and obscure the truth. And this was true, by the way, even in Vietnam. I don't know if any of you have watched Ken Burns' documentary. I haven't seen it yet. But if you look at the initial reporting on Vietnam, it was mythic, as Lawrence LeSean writes, rather than censored. It looked for those stories that catered to what the American public wanted to hear. Our hometown hero helping the poor Vietnamese villager, whatever kind of very narrow narrative that celebrated American virtue, American goodness. It was only when the American public turned against the war, and the press is a reactive force. It was only when the public turned against the war, largely because a lot of middle-class kids were getting killed, that the press was free to report at the latter end of the Vietnam conflict in what LeSean would call a sensory manner, i.e., you wouldn't carry out those lies of omission that are typical in wartime. That notion of comradeship, physical courage is something that I saw a lot of in wartime, and it's certainly a human or a characteristic that I admire. Good war correspondents have to have it. But moral courage I almost never saw, because moral courage means standing up against that sense of comradeship, which there's a very fine book that I like very much by J. Glenn Gray called A Warrior's Reflections on Men in Battle. He'd been a World War II veteran. He actually got drafted into the U.S. Army in World War II the day he finished his orals at Columbia in philosophy. And going to war, he was in quite a bit of combat in Italy. It was fascinating having that philosophical background and reflection. But I think, and this is a kind of something that I expand upon in my own book, and I quote Gray. But comradeship is very different from friendship. This is Gray's argument. Friendship is about opening yourself up to someone else, making yourself vulnerable, being able to accept the criticism of a friend. And as Gray said, if we're totally honest, most of us only probably have 2 or 3 real friends, if we even have friends, of that depth. And comradeship is the opposite of friendship. Comradeship is about subsuming the self into the group. And comradeship, in order to have potency, must always have an external enemy that the group defends itself against. And Kennedy writes about this, I think, in Crowds and Power. And so that sense of comradeship is often mistaken for friendship. And you can watch veterans, when they come back from conflicts, seek to recreate that comradeship. Because you really are in a group where you are called upon sometimes to potentially sacrifice your life for the other. I mean, any good one of the rules, having been in a lot of combat units, is that if you are with a unit that is undisciplined and that will leave its wounded and dead behind, you get out of that unit as fast as you can. Because good units will put themselves at risk to retrieve even their own dead. And that's the power of comradeship. And many people who come out of that experience seek or spend the rest of their lives trying to recreate it, but they can't. Because it is a peculiar phenomenon that requires not just the projection of force, but the threat of not only force, but annihilation. And that sense of comradeship is absolutely devastating to moral independence. Because to stand up morally, which Chelsea Manning did when she stood up and exposed US war crimes by passing information on the WikiLeaks, makes you suddenly defined as the enemy of self. And in wartime, that ability to speak truth, not only about power, but about ourselves, is one that has such high cost that it's almost never done. And not only by soldiers and Marines, but also by the press, which becomes caught up in wartime. I will just close. I ended up in Kosovo. War photographers and war correspondents are a small fraternity who leap from war to war to war around the globe, so that when I was covering the war in Kosovo, I was there with two other reporters who I had covered the war with in El Salvador 20 years before. Many of my colleagues, including my closest friend, who I'd worked with for 10 years, Kurt Short, are dead. Kurt, with another friend of mine, a Spanish photographer named Miguel Gil Moreno, were killed in Sierra Leone. Kurt and I covered Iraq, and then we covered Bosnia, and then we covered Kosovo. And what happens, I think, and that is analogous to an addiction, is that even though you reach a point where what you're doing is deeply self-destructive, just psychologically, physically, in every way possible, you can't cope with a world not at war. So when I was in Sarajevo, because you were getting 24 hours of shelling and you were never sleeping, every 3 weeks, the New York Times would pull me out, and I would end up, in a matter of maybe 7 or 8 hours in Paris. And I couldn't cope. All I had to do was figure out a way to get back to Sarajevo as fast as I could. Because however dark the pathologies were, at least I was in an environment, like a junkie, and with people who understood. You lose the ability to communicate with a world not at war. And this, of course, is what Freud got in Eros and Thanatos. War is Thanatos, the death instinct. It is opposed to Eros, the life instinct, everything about nurturing or caring, preserving, loving. And it is as seductive. War is, and even I would say death, is as seductive as life. Maybe even more so. And that constant flirtation, which is what it is with death. So that Kurt, for instance, had gotten out. He should have gotten out, and he couldn't stay away. He went back for one more hit, along with Elizabeth Newford and Michael Kelly and other friends of mine who are all dead. They couldn't adjust to a world not at war, to a world where those adrenaline-driven highs and that kind of dark pathology didn't define their existence. And I think in that sense, those of us who have spent a lot of time in war have many similarities with those who become addicted to drugs. Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to open the floor if we could for any questions you may have.
I'm just wondering about the similarities between humanitarian aid workers, and it seems similar to what you're describing.
Yeah, humanitarian aid workers who work in conflict zones.
Yeah.
Yeah, very similar, which is why those people will also leap from war to war to war, and why we keep seeing them again and again and again.
As I was saying, have any shards from the bomb shells ever fallen into the drinking water?
Well, he's asking if shards, are you talking about uranium enriched? So in Bosnia, in the fall of '95, NATO bombed, and they used uranium enriched bombs. And and what we would see is craters where nothing would grow. I went into Kuwait. I went into occupied Kuwait with the U.S. Marine Corps, and then when the war ended, that was the last tank battle of the war, we were actually north of Kuwait City, and we were about 5 kilometers from Kuwait, from the highway that runs north from Kuwait into Iraq, which became the Highway of Death. And that was a very tough moment because the Marines were halted, and as the Iraqis fled, for political purposes, the Syrians and the Egyptians, who had done none of the fighting, I remember when we entered Kuwait, we actually drove past the Syrian army who were literally drinking tea before we went into combat. And they would liberate the city. And so there were mines in the desert. And I'm sitting there as a reporter going, I'm going to lose my story. So I was in a Jeep, and I figured I'd just drive as fast. I wasn't going to drive cautiously, because you can't see mines. So I would just drive as fast as I could, and if I hit one, it'd be over quick. And I ended up on that highway and then drove down into Kuwait as the Iraqis were literally, I was in a Marine Corps uniform, as literally the Iraqis were fleeing north. And what happened in that whole 6-mile long front of Iraqi vehicles were struck not long after by the U.S. Air Force with uranium-depleted weapons, which left a kind of white dust because I went up there after it was hit. So the vehicles were all charred and burned, including corpses, blackened corpses trying to climb out of the windows and stuff. But it was coated with this very fine white dust, and they sent American soldiers to clean it up, and most of those soldiers got very sick.
Where will we find examples of journalism where there's some sense of moral integrity or independence? What type of, where could we go to find that?
Well, that's an important question, because foreign reporting has collapsed in the United States. There aren't any foreign reporters anymore. When I began, so I went to El Salvador when I was 24. When I began, every major paper had a foreign section. Not just the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Baltimore Sun, and the Christian Science Monitor, who I worked for. Now all of those foreign bureaus are shut down. All of them. The TV, they don't have foreign bureaus anymore. It's all gone. So there were problems with, I always look for byliners. There were good reporters who were willing to risk their careers to report the truth, and sometimes lost their careers, even at the New York Times. Ray Bonner reporting on the El Mazote massacre in El Salvador, for which he was pushed out of the paper, but they're there. But now, the paucity of reporting, that's what worries me. And to be a good foreign correspondent, you have to be bicultural. It's not, you can't just fly in for a week. You have to speak the language. You have to understand the culture, the history, the traditions. That takes years. I mean, I was 7 years in the Middle East. I was 6 years in Latin America. And it takes years before you're able to read another culture and then translate the reality of that culture back to an American audience, and you understand both cultures. And I fear that we've lost it, so that, I mean, part of the Islamophobia in this country, which is appallingly racist, for those of us who come out of the Middle East, is able to be buttressed because there's so little true information. I don't even like the word Arab because most of the people I work with have names. Mohammed, Ahmed, Faiza. I mean, they're friends. And the kind of hate talk that is now normalized within the mainstream towards Muslims is for incredibly frightening. And I think that part of that is the decay of systems of information. And I just want to tell you, I mean, I could tell you many, many stories, but I just want to tell you one. as to why, one story, as to why that demonization of Muslims is so galling to those of us who come out of the Middle East. When I left Kuwait City after the occupation, I went to Basra during the Shiite uprising, which took place at the end of the First Gulf War. And I joined the Shiite rebels until I was captured and taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. They took my Jeep, they took my M65 jacket, which had the 3 books I was reading in my pocket, Homer's The Iliad, which I almost know by memory, the greatest book ever written on war, Outcast of the Islands by Conrad, and Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, which W.H. Auden says is the greatest play. It's another lecture. And I was with a unit, heavy combat, we were ambushed the second day, 16 hours of fighting. At one point I was behind a house, the Shiite rebels were running down an alley, the clips were going empty, they were wearing Soviet pouches, which had the loose bullets, and they were throwing the pouches on the ground and the empty clips, and I was literally putting the bullets in the clips and handing them up, because if they came down the alley, we would all be dead. And then the last 24 hours, I was turned over to the Iraqi Muhabarat. I was put on a helicopter, turned over to the Iraqi secret police, who were killers, and locked in a room without food and water for 24 hours. And in Baghdad, the roofs are flat. And at dawn, the women and children go up to the tops of the roofs to bake bread. And I'm there. Now remember, we have just bombed their country. The South had no clean water. I was watching women and children drink water out of mud puddles. And we were all sick, and that because of that bad water, this would kill the children. And so in Arabic, I yelled out the window, I'm an American journalist, I'm being held captive, I haven't had anything to drink or eat. And those women gave the children warm bread and to scamper across the roofs to pass into my window so I could eat. That, every time I hear people talk about Muslims in the way that we've normalized it in this country, I always think of that image, that moment. And I can sit here and spend the next 2 hours telling you story after story like that, of people whose goodness, whose moral probity, whose compassion, whose decency, and whose integrity are not only to be questioned, but must be admired. All of them are Muslim.
What can we do?
Well, what can we do? I mean, we're in a very frightening moment. We live in a moment where hate talk is normalized within systems, cable systems, from the White House. I mean, I worry about another terrorist attack if it comes out of the Islamic world. The way the systems and power will misuse it, and what will happen to our Muslim brothers and sisters. The kind we've watched Trump, in essence, greenlight hate crimes and hate speech towards African Americans, LGBT people. I mean, this guy's really a monstrosity, and very frightening, and very dangerous. Yes, a buffoon, but dangerous. And I guess I always say on a campus like this is that you should build relationships with Muslim student groups so that when this happens, it's not just a bunch of olive-skinned people out there by themselves, but you're standing with them, because it's going to happen. It's coming.
What should the Muslims do in case something like that happens?
Well, Muslim communities are already living under terror of heavy infiltration, not only by Homeland Security and the FBI, but the NYPD. Does anyone know the case of Hashmi out of Brooklyn College? Fahed Hashmi? Look it up. Holy Land 5 out of Texas. I mean, they clearly are going after Muslim leaders. I guess if I was to say anything to Muslims, it was, don't let them intimidate you into silence. That you have to speak out. And you have to speak out with the militancy, the violations of your being and of your rights to man.
Okay, we are running short on time, so just last two.
Why do you think race issues are such an important topic in this country, and do you think it's the same in other countries?
Every society that falls into the kind of physical, political, economic, and moral disintegration that we have fallen into, the power elites always seek to scapegoat the vulnerable. So that was true in Yugoslavia. The Serbs demonizing the Muslims or the Croats. In a way of channeling a legitimate rage and anger, which you're watching being done by the white working class, towards a segment of the population. We know since 2008 that African Americans economically have suffered more than any other group in the United States. And yet, those who stoke the hatred among the white working class are able to say that these people have benefited at your expense. Very similar, in Nazi Germany, the Jews were only 1% of Germany. And that's what demagogues do, always. They did it in Rwanda, they did it in Yugoslavia, they did it in Weimar, and they're doing it here. Because what we have is an incompetent, failed, and corrupt elite, which through the processes of deindustrialization and neoliberalism has pillaged, cannibalized, and destroyed our country for their personal gain. And they are the enemy. And the more that becomes apparent, the more they will stoke this kind of hate talk, rage, racism, as a way to channel feelings of frustration and anger, and legitimize acts of physical violence as an outlet for that rage. And that's precisely what Trump is doing, and why he's so dangerous. Someone else?
Last question.
Okay.
Just curious, you mentioned the truth about WikiLeaks. Can you elaborate on that? Can you elaborate on, because you mentioned WikiLeaks?
WikiLeaks?
Yeah.
Sure. WikiLeaks, well, first of all, I worked for the New York Times for 15 years, and I have published classified documents that were leaked to me in the New York Times. I verify them, find out whether they're true, but if I get them, I print them. Now, one of the things the government doesn't tell you is that they often will leak classified documents to reporters from the New York Times if it makes them look good. And I've run stuff that I was leaked stuff by the Mossad that shut down a small airport outside of Hamburg, Germany, that was being run by the Iranian government. They were shipping, it was all true. I went to the airport, they were all Iranians, I wrote the story, they shut it down. So there's always, the powerful interests are always leaking stuff to reporters. Every once in a while, you'll get leaked stuff that will expose the machinations or inner workings of power, which is what Chelsea Manning did when she leaked these documents to WikiLeaks. So it ripped back the veil. It's what we saw with the Podesta emails that were given to WikiLeaks. And in a free society, we don't live in one, but in a free society, we have a right to know what our government is doing in our name, how it is acting, how it is behaving. And that's why the corporate state has been so fierce in its attack on whistleblowers within the government. Because now, there is, if you watch closely, I have friends who, I did investigative work for the Times. Actually, after 9/11, I was based in Paris and covered Al-Qaeda in Europe and North Africa. And friends of mine, they would say, if they can do investigative reports, but not on government. Everything has been shut down. So the last redoubt of people who can expose what's happening in government are hackers. People like Jeremy Hammond, which is why they are so fierce against hackers and against whistleblowers. So you have the Espionage Act, passed by Woodrow Wilson, 1917, which was to prosecute people who gave sensitive government information to a hostile power. That's what the act was passed for. So up until Obama became president in 2009, it was used 3 times against whistleblowers, including Daniel Ellsberg. Obama used it 9 times against all sorts of people, including Chelsea Manning, Kiriakou, and others, who attempted to call out to tell the government, tell the public what the government was doing and what was illegal. This is what Snowden did, which is why I would argue of the last decade, there are probably very few Americans who are as heroic or noble as Edward Snowden, because he kind of gave up, any kind of normality. That's why he left the country. He knew he'd be caught. And that shutting down of information, in a free society, you shouldn't need hackers to get that information. But that's all we have left, which is why the government is going so fiercely, why they demonized Assange, who I know and who I visit in the embassy. I actually went to the Oxford Union debate, and the debate was, I debated the guy who had been the chief counsel for the National Security Agency, O'Neill. You have to go in there and talk. British snobbery kind of outdoes even Harvard. I told Julian I was going, so I stopped by the Ecuadorian embassy and see him. He said, well, come a day early and I'll coach you. But that, as a journalist, terrifies me. That, we should have a free press that shines a light into the inner workings of power so the American public can see how power works. And Democrat and Republican, Obama and Bush, have done terrible, terrible acts of destruction to the free press. And I would argue that Obama's assault on civil liberties are in fact even worse than those carried out by George W. Bush. Great, thank you.
And on that note, hey, just a couple of quick logistical things. Those of you who you had one more question and we're out of time, and you can stay a second. Very generously offered to take some questions to the front, so please do feel free to come to the front. Those of you who are students here, please do make sure you sign in before you leave. Your professors are taking your attendance based on whether you sign in or not. Those of you at the back, thank you for your patience. I know it's really warm back there and you had to stand through all this, so thank you. Faculty who are part of the seminar, we're going